as you heard Lonnie introduce the work I've done, I've not done this before. This is new for me. Um, and I'll tell a little bit about how I've come into this and where I'm going. It's very exciting. I appreciate and welcome comments. My email address, of course, is levin@hawaii.edu. A draft of the paper is nearly ready to go up on Social Science Research Network, SSRN. And it's about 20,000 words already, co-written with my former student Makoto Kurokawa. This work begins with a dedication in memory of Professor Hiroko Hayashi, and I know Gay, and I know Justice McKenna knew Professor Hayashi, and others may have met her. For years, not just in the last several weeks, I have called Professor Hayashi the Ruth Bader Ginsburg of Japan. The difference being that Japan's government did not have the good sense to put her on the Supreme Court where she should have gone. Like Justice Ginsburg, Hiroko began her career as an academic and also worked as a lawyer in groundbreaking theoretical and practical jurisprudence. And she was responsible as the brain tank. There were others involved as well in the idea that Japan's civil code could be used as a means to seek damages for sexual harassment in the workplace. And it was successful in a very famous 1992 case from Fukuoka. Hiroko visited here several times, every time she came, it was a delight. She taught classes at the law school. Unfortunately, she passed away way too soon in 2016. And when I introduced the pioneers in law teaching in Japan, this work in part began because I was curious, was Hiroko the first Japanese woman law professor? You'll find out she wasn't, but she certainly was one of the pioneers. The next place that this work began was a little over 2 years ago when I got invited to go speak at Harvard Law School for a conference on Japanese law. And my thought was, what am I going to talk about? And with that, what I decided I would talk about was gender in the law. It would be a new topic for me. But I realized that we really nobody in my field had done much, and I didn't know much. With student Callista Hiraoka, we produced a bibliography of all the writings in English on gender in the law in Japan. And that is now published in Asia Pacific Law and Policy Journal here at the law school. And I asked Joan if she could chat up the link to that. It's on SSRN as well. We've got more than 150 articles in the bibliography and sorted by topic. So if you're doing any research on this, it's meant to be a tool. As well, I looked for some low-hanging fruit that would be available to talk about in that presentation, and I found some fairly easy. This is the bibliography, by the way. You can see we developed a taxonomy of topics and some of the materials found. But there wasn't much, and that gave me reason to say we should do more. What I did find was it answered another question of my own curiosity. Who were Japan's first women lawyers? And again, I thought, why don't we know that? I mistakenly guessed that the first women lawyers would have been post-war, but they were not. They entered the bar in 1938. All three of them are amazing in their life stories and the work that they did. You can see more a little bit about them in that paper from Harvard. Masako Nakato went on to become the first president of a prefectural bar association, as well as the first woman president of a prefectural bar association, and the first woman to be on the governing board of the National Bar Association. Ai Kume helped found the Women in Law Association of Japan. She was also a vice delegate for the nation of Japan to the United Nations in the 1960s, and continued on in her career. And Yoshiko Mibuchi was one of the two women in Japan to be the first judges in the early post-war. And so all three remarkable, and we need longer biographies about them in at least in English. There are writings about them in Japanese, but if there's any graduate students at the seminar here today looking for a good topic, there you go for it. And also in the low-hanging fruit category was the number of women lawyers in Japan. Not to my surprise, the growth rate in the 1950s was, and the number in Japan was very, very low. And then picked up in the 60s and 70s into the 80s and 90s. And then what you're seeing on this chart is the growth rate. So the change in the gender balance by percent. And the highest pace, which was still fairly slow, was from about 1996 to 2014. But what I also saw here, to my surprise, was the rate of change has stopped, virtually stopped. So right now it's about 18% of Japan's lawyers are women, but it is not changing now. What I also discovered, though, was people are paying attention there. So that did not need my attention. But a second place was going to be legal scholarship, because legal scholarship feeds the pipeline to lawyering, among other things. And there, I had the impression that there was work to be done, although there are good things happening now. And here's a perfect example. This is a leading law journal, Juristo, probably the most famous law journal. This is their 1500th anniversary. It's a big deal, from December 2016. And they're studying, the future of law, korekara no Horo Tujiho, right? The future of law and, law practice in Japan. And there's the panel, which is virtually a panel, but for one person, one woman in the upper right corner who is a labor lawyer, but otherwise you can see this. So it dawned on me that legal education was another place to be explored and was yet unexplored. I then set out to look at it, and I'm going to continue my introduction for a little bit because I think there's some important things to share. First one is, what words should I use? And I'm already challenged, because what words should I be using in English or in Japanese? In English, we often speak of feminism, and that is a word that is familiar to us, although more recently in English, it is common to not use the word in singular, but in plural, feminisms, to recognize that different people have different feminists have different views of what feminism should be. We get in trouble with that for Japanese because Japanese doesn't have the plural, as probably most everyone in this audience knows, in its language form. So feminism in Japan is written with katakana as feminism. And I'm not sure if you can go with feminisms or whatever, but we do sort of have this struggle for how do you convey that. We also can speak of women's rights, and this is a part of the discourse that has been used for a very long time in English and as well in Japanese. So even from the early 20th century, there was discussions of Fujin Kaiho, which is probably the closest, or Josei Kaiho, Fujin Kaiho, wives' rights, or they became abbreviated into Joken. The terms are not used so much now, although this is somewhat close to the discourse in international law, where you have the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women as an international treaty that Japan is a party to, that is focused in rights-based discourse. But if we can't use that, or that is faded, another one is women's liberation. In Japan, women's liberation from the 70s became shortened, as words do in Japanese, to ribu, but it's been used more often than not recently as sort of as a negative, a pejorative, if you will. Ano kata wa ribu desu, right? And it isn't necessarily viewed as favorably. So that phrasing is gone. what might we use? Well, gender equality is certainly discourse that is used commonly in the United States now and is good language, I think, to help us understand, although we have to think about what's gender and we have to think about what's equality, but it gets us started. How do you take that to Japanese? Well, gender equality actually is the term now used commonly in Japan as an English term. But how do you take that to Japanese? Do you go with jendai equal? Or danjo byodo is obviously the closest literal translation that we can grab. But the Japanese government in the 1990s chose not to use danjo byodo, and there is scholarship written by a number of authors, including our colleague Mireille Koikare, on that, that the Japanese government instead chose the phrasing danjo kyodo sankaku. Now, how do we translate that back to English becomes the next question. The Japanese government translates that back to English as gender equality. But if you know Japanese, it's a much more clunky literal translation that would be male-female joint planning and co-participation, which isn't going to go very far. And so danjo kyodo sankaku now rolls off of people's tongues in Japan. That is the term used to reference the idea of gender equality. But again, the scholarship that's been written about it questions whether or not the connotations and implications are the same. So much so that some authors have suggested that when we speak of it in English, we shouldn't translate it over to gender equality. We should translate it over to DKS. Another phrasing that was picked up in the United States in the early 1990s was gender free. But again, in some of that scholarship, you can read that gender free was used by male patriarchy in Japan in the same way that the notion of color blindness has been used in support of white supremacy in the United States, meaning, well, let's just stop talking about it. So while gender free somewhat works in English, it does not work well in Japanese. My personal suggestion, these are my own little inventions, are gender wise and gender just. I'm not sure anybody will pick up on them, but I think that gets us close to what we're talking about. There's still room for negotiation, but this also comes close to what Professor Chizuko Ueno, one of Japan's most famous feminist scholars, wrote us, that the goal should be to build a desirable society. We want safe products. We want products that are gentle to children. We need to think about what is desirable. Is it okay just to increase the number of women in jobs and other positions, right? It's not just quantitative, but it needs to be qualitative. And I think the phrasing helps us get there. Although again, we can always argue. The other thing I would like to say before I go much further is just to recognize my own place in this as a white, privileged American male. And recognizing, most importantly, that we have not gotten this all figured out in the United States. And here on this screen is just a very, very quick introduction of some of those pieces. And you can follow up in any of those directions. But the Me Too movement and Harvey Weinstein's, the horrors that were exposed from Harvey Weinstein, but others doing similar. Equality Can't Wait is a program sponsored by Melinda Gates. And if you look online, she enlisted a whole number of comedians to start to talk about it in a somewhat entertaining way. There is a weekly newsletter that I get that I learn a lot from, Arwa Madavi, on the week in patriarchy, and check it out. With the hearings at the Supreme Court today, that brings back sadness to see Brett Kavanaugh, and that he might be viewed as honorable, but I think he showed a lot of dishonor personally. And Carol Gilligan, one of the most famous authors in this area, her most recent writing, Patriarchy's Resurgence and Feminist Resistance. So we see that we are in a tension in her view, but it is not necessarily that we've succeeded in any way. Even when we look at legal education, Lani Gunier published this very important work in 1997, Becoming Gentlemen, Women, Law School, and Institutional Change. Marina Angel has a number of articles that address this, and the pink ghetto of American legal education. And even in 2019, look here, Mira Diro published a book that is very important and well regarded, addressing issues concerning women of color in the American Legal Academy. So we've not solved these problems. Even as I speak about Japan, I am well aware of that. Let me take a quick drink and go on. So to begin this work, what Makoto and I did was we started looking at trying to assess how can we figure out the number and voice of women in legal education. As I said, Jurist is one of the most important journals in Japan, law journals in Japan, if not singly the most important. And every year they publish a Juyo Hanrei Kaisetsu, the interpretation of the most important cases of the prior year. For a variety of topics, a moderator is selected by the editors of the journal, who will then help them and select the most important cases of the prior year. And they then enlist a number of authors to write short case notes. It is prestigious is very prestigious to be a moderator. One of the people I spoke to said, well, they're almost always from Tokyo University and Kyoto University. And then they have the power and control to decide what cases will be looked at and who will be writing them. So it was relatively easy to go back 30 years and just count. So in 1989, 1999, 2009, and 2019, we could see what's happened. What we could see was there has never been a woman moderator in any of the subject areas that this very prestigious and important publication puts out. There's room for improvement there. On the other hand, when we look at the authors, we can see that there have been women authors, and we can even see that the number of women authors has not only been increasing, but in the last decade, increased at a faster rate. In our more in-depth study that's coming out in the paper being developed, we estimate the percentage of women teaching in law in Japan right now to be about 15%. So if the percent of authors in this last issue was 24%, it's actually a degree of, if you will, affirmative action, perhaps, that women's women's are getting a chance and are being presented and amplified in legal scholarship. But again, it is time to start bringing in some women moderators, I believe. Another measure on a more single year snapshot are the monthly issues of Jurist. So Jurist comes out each month, and we could count the number. There's little short pieces in the journal, in the art magazine, and then larger lead articles. So we could count the lead articles in Jurist over the course of just 1 year more recently. We found there were 4 issues where there were no women authors in the lead articles. And overall, it was 12%. They varied from month to month. But again, 12% perhaps coming close to 15% of women in the legal academy in Japan. But certainly there's no apparent worries on behalf of the editors to put out 4 issues that are only authored by men. Some years ago, Jurist split off to a second magazine that is more focused on law students and younger scholars, called Ronkyu Jurist. It's more, and so this is, I wouldn't call it junior jurist, but it's a little bit like that. And there we could see that the number of women authors is higher, 21%. But still, we could see, it comes out quarterly. We could see in the past several years, 4 issues where there were just 1 or 2 women authors. And then very commonly in these magazines, there will be zadankai. So sort of they just put a bunch of people in a room, put a tape recorder in, let them start talking. And next thing you know, you have an article for the magazine on a subject. In 4 of the quarterly issues, there were all male zadankai. So not even tokenism in those pieces. By way of contrast, I looked at what I would guess to be the 3 most elite law journals in the United States, and the number of women authors there in that same year. And we could see Yale Law Journal. I am a Yale Law grad, so kind of happy to see Yale coming out on top with a majority of its lead authors being women in the year. Stanford with 40%, and Harvard Law Review 37%. So lower than Stanford or Yale, but still higher than the average in Japan, giving some measure of comparison perhaps. Meanwhile, probably the next most famous law journal and more academic one is Horo Tujiho. And in August 2019, they came out with a special issue of Heisei no Hogaku, so legal scholarship in the Heisei era. Let's see what they have. So it turns out that there was just a token 1 of the 10 articles were authored by a woman. There was a zadankai, one of these panels, titled Heisei no Hogaku Kyoiku, so legal education in the Heisei era, and that was a panel of 5 authors with no women. And Makoto went through the entire issue to see, is there any substantive content with gender-oriented purview, and she found none. So not a good piece in developing the voice of women in legal scholarship in Japan. The next thing that we do in this work is we try to understand why this might be. And we can see a very different history. And that history comes from the 1960s. Until 1960, both the United States and Japan had virtually no women in legal education. That's when we parted ways. Now, Japan is a civil law system. Its legal education system is primarily at the undergraduate level. It had, there are many differences that we can look to, but still there were a few things that really made a difference. And in some ways, this might even let Japan a little bit off the hook in that they didn't necessarily have some of the same social dynamics that brought about change in the United States. So in the early 1960s, 2 amazing women of color, one from Hawaii, Patsy Mink, and if you don't know who she is, you should. And her statue stands in front of the Hawaii State Library downtown. And if you've ever heard of Title IX, which created equal opportunity in education, and not just for women's athletics, but in all aspects of education, it is now known as the Patsy Takemoto Mink Equal Opportunity in Education Act. That's Rep. Mink right there, standing in front of the United States Capitol. And she went to Congress with a mission to help improve equality for women. Meanwhile, an amazing scholar who you may also not have heard of, and I think we should ask, why have so many people not heard of these women? Pauli Murray began writing, and she wrote a really impressive but influential piece called Jane Crow, and basically trying to apply the civil rights issues relating to race to gender and gender equality. And so their work was influential. It was not just them. And Polly was one of the co-founders of the National Organization of Women. But the work of them and the National Organization of Women encouraged President Lyndon Johnson to sign an executive order 11375, which was the predecessor to Title IX, that demanded that any educational institution receiving federal funding needed to begin addressing gender equality. And so that's what began the change, because American law schools as well needed to start thinking about what they were doing. Meanwhile, the war in Vietnam was happening in the United States, and men were being drafted to go fight in the war. And so the number of men available to attend law school and pay tuition was dropping. And with that, American law schools also realized they needed to fill seats, and they began bringing in more women as students. On the left is Ruth Bader Ginsburg as a younger law scholar. And she was out there as a true pioneer, but we can see this chart down here where the number of, over the course of the late 1960s into the 70s, and I entered law school in 1980, the number of women law students percentage is in red in the line, and the percentage of the number of women law professors, tenure-track law professors, are the blue bars. And you can see they both rose in that time. And again, that's what we didn't have in Japan, and I'll show you that in a second. One of the other important points, though, is when participants from that time look back, the law scholars, the women law professors of that day, commonly attribute the voice and energy of law students as being the principal change dynamic. That it was law students, both women and men, pushing for change, insisting on change in hiring, in pedagogy, in administration, in policies that would reshape American legal education. And so that's really where the United States and Japan diverged. And so we had the political impacts as well as the Vietnam War making a difference in a way that wasn't happening in Japan. In Japan, there was, as I said, when you get to 1960, the paucity, the scarcity of women teaching law was comparable to the United States, but there were some incredible pioneers. And in the paper we're developing, we have short biographies of all of them. And I have to tell you, in writing the paper, it was just inspiring to read and learn about these women. They were each amazing in so many ways. And then the second cohort, and you can see Hiroko Hayashi, who entered law teaching in 1972. But we can see, however, that from 1960 to 1974, 5 women went into the profession. Go back to this chart. From 1960, the number was about 14. And if we go to 1974, we are at 250. So if we think about what those 236 women, if I've done my math correctly, the difference of 236 women and their allies could accomplish in that time, it's going to be huge. Who they will teach, what they will teach, just the fact that they are standing in the front of the room, what they will write and what ideas they will come up with. So this gap emerged in Japan, and even we go as far as 1988, and just 21 women, as best as we could find, became law professors in Japan. A few of them still teaching, Kamiya Sensei, Mizuno Sensei, who I got to meet last year I got to meet both Kamiya Sensei and Mizuno Sensei, and Goto Sensei. And then I've not met Nishikawa sensei, and I'm hoping on a next trip to Japan to meet some of the others. Terao sensei, now Kakishima, she actually taught here, she lectured here at the University of Hawaii about 20 years ago. First woman law professor at Todai. So we can see this incredible parting of the ways. And we believe that that makes a difference, not just in legal education, but further in society. That when you are missing women in legal education in terms of scholarship, teaching, administration, you miss an incredibly important change vector for the society as a whole. So that this gap, I believe, is a piece, a factor of the puzzle of Japan's continuing gender gap in the big picture. And I will say there is progress being made, and really important progress being made. But with the room to catch up, we can ask what might be done. Looking from the United States, and that may or may not answer the questions, I found these things that seem to have been most important. The first one, almost all the women who look back on the 60s and 70s speak of the founding of the section of women in legal education at the American Association of Law Schools as being incredibly important. Japan has two organizations. One is the Genda Ho Gakkai. I'll actually be giving this presentation in December at their annual meeting. And then the Women in Law Society. They're both a little different. The Gender Ho Gakkai is a gakkai. It focuses on scholarship and writing, whereas the section on women in legal education is focused on alliance, on bringing women together as an affinity group within ALS. It also works on scholarship, but there are other places where that happens as well. Meanwhile, the Women in Law Association in Japan is also very important, but it is more diverse, involving women lawyers as well as scholars. So it's not really bringing together as well women in legal law teaching. I'm told that women in law teaching in Japan informally gather, and they especially do so at the gatherings of like the Shiho Gakkai and the Koho Gakkai, the Public Law Association, the Private Law Association, the Kenpo Gakkai, at the various Gakkai. Women do informally gather. I went to the Law and Society Association, and there was a luncheon for women only. So some of this is happening, but perhaps not at the same level. And it's been very important. Scholarship. So we can look at 1971. Here's already a symposium from Valparaiso University Law Review on women and the law. And we can see Pauli Murray had a piece there, Economic and Educational Inequality Based on Sex, an overview. And we can see Ruth Bader Ginsburg had a piece who already focusing on these issues, Treatment of Women by the Law, Awakening Consciousness in Law Schools. On the right, you can see an article. There is a massive project in the works called Feminist Judgments by a tremendous number of scholars publishing books in various areas of the law where they take major case decisions and they rewrite them how they ought to have been written from a feminist point of view, and then use those for teaching. So it's a really, but I'm on a mailing list from SSRN of Gender in the Law. I get 10, 15 new work, information about 10 or 15 new writings a week relating to gender in the law in English. And so scholarship is incredibly important. Information, the Feminist Law Professors blog by Bridget Crawford, Twitter, etc. All of this just empowers and makes the work better. Capacity building. Notice there's now a Women's Leadership in Legal Academia conference. It had its second, this was the second. I'm guessing 2020 did not happen at the University of Virginia. It's even moving up to the level not of women in law teaching, but women's leadership in legal academia, towards becoming deans, towards becoming university administrators, etc. Here's the gathering in 2019, and my friend Danielle Conway is in there, and Danielle says she thinks it would be incredible if any scholars from Japan were interested to attend. The timing is not so good for Japanese professors in July, but if someone, for example, is here on an annual study, it would be a chance to go. Lastly, is in this analysis are our students, and they are, of course, our future. And students on screen, I can't see anyone on screen today. It's different from teaching in a room, but for the students on our screen, you are our future, and we're counting on you. So how do we think about our students, and how can we empower them? Or how can we help them empower themselves? In the United States, we have an organization called Ms. JD, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to the success of women in law schools and the legal profession. And within there is the National Women Law Students Organization. So this is happening in a way that I think is not replicated in Japan. And if it did, it might be good, but I'm also cautious. I'm cautious because there has been a feminist backlash in Japan. And look at these two articles in the Japan's Times and the imagery they select. It is good that students take a stand against the rising number of sexual violence cases at Japan's universities. But what does it say that they select an image that shows a woman's back? That to me, I'm picking a message that this is a dangerous space. It's a Getty image, right? They didn't go onto a campus. They didn't get a spokesperson, but still how they selected that. Here is a press conference. I think it's at FCCJ, the Foreign Correspondents Club in Japan. Japanese students and professors push for an end to sexual harassment of job seekers. Again, it's fantastic that students in Japan are beginning to speak out, but worrisome for me that this woman felt that she needed to wear sunglasses and mask herself somewhat in making that presentation. This is last December. So I was actually quite happy to see this in the Japan Times just 2 weeks ago. Gender equality in Japan gets a push from young activists. And in this instance, we are seeing the faces of people. I don't know if that, since it is Getty Images, I'm going to guess that that's not necessarily the people involved. But nonetheless, it does perhaps suggest some positive change. Meanwhile, again, this was the COVID gathering in Tokyo. So how many of them are University of Tokyo graduates who did not have a single woman as a law professor, did not see a woman in any position of authority that wasn't clerical at the law school, and had a minuscule number of women classmates while they were studying? That suggests something to me. On the other hand, while they're not sitting as formally and the room is more messy, this is Vice President Pence's gathering at the White House for the US COVID task force, and there is not a woman in the room there either. There's work to be done all around. Some cheers. This photograph of 16 women are the editors-in-chief of the 16 law reviews last year in the United States at the most elite law schools. It was a big deal when Barack Obama was the very first person of color to become the president of the Harvard Law Review. The senior most editors-in-chief of these journals go on to Supreme Court clerkships, or even perhaps the Supreme Court. These are the most prestigious, or among the most prestigious slots of accomplishment in American legal education for students. And last year, 16 of 16 were women. As well, This is from the American Association of Law Schools last year, where we have an increasing percentage of women as deans. Every woman in this photograph is a dean of an American law school, including my good friend Danielle Conway, standing in the center, who used to teach here, and then with the blue neck piece sitting in the front row is the newly arrived dean at the Richardson Law School, Camille Nelson. I think it is 38% of the deans in the United States are now women. At Japan's law schools, it's 4 of 35, or about 11%. So in conclusion, I think we can talk about these words, and we should talk about these words. I think these words matter for legal education because legal education is not just a place to bide our time. Legal education changes the law, changes what happens in the courts, in the legislature, in government administration, in politics, in journalism. Legal education, I believe, matters. And so to the extent that Japan has a gap in legal education as to the circumstances of women, I think that is a piece of the gap that is well noted as to Japan with regards to gender more generally. This work is nearly on SSRN. Hopefully by the end of October, it will be there, co-written with Makoto Kurokawa. Longer biographies of most of the early pioneers, or all of the early pioneers, much the same data, and then a longer presentation of that history and exploration of its impact. And I would like to thank the UH Mānoa Center for Japanese Studies Endowment, which made a lot of this research possible, particularly my travels to Japan last year. The Richardson Kashiwagi Endowment, which similarly supported this work, especially my hiring of Makoto as a research assistant, and Makoto, who was phenomenal as a research assistant, and I'm honored to have her as a co-author. We miss Hiroko. Here's her vision of Hawaii, and may we all have a future that incorporates her vision of society. Mahalo.